is LBC. From Global, leading Britain's conversation, The Nigel Farage Show.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Well, a leaked letter a few days ago from the Attorney General, which had been written to the Cabinet, suggested that perhaps we could be stuck in the backstop indefinitely. Namely, we couldn't get out of it unless the European Union agreed also. We could be trapped in this customs union for many, many years to come. That, of course, has led to, and David Davis started it, but the Labour Party, many others, screaming and saying, can we please see the legal advice? Now, normally, legal advice given to Cabinet doesn't go out in the public domain, but given that we've got next Tuesday, perhaps one of the biggest votes in Parliament we've seen for decades, it seemed only right and proper that people should ask for it. So, what has happened today is the government have put out not the entire legal advice, but a full, reasoned political statement. And standing up in the House of Commons today was the Attorney General, Geoffrey Cox QC, and he explained to the House of Commons the legal advice he'd given the government on the Northern Irish backstop.
If the protocol were to come into force, it would continue to apply in international law unless and until it was superseded by the intended subsequent agreement which achieved the stated objectives of maintaining the necessary conditions for continued North-South cooperation, avoiding a hard border, and protecting the Belfast Agreement in all its dimensions. There is, therefore, no unilateral right for either party to terminate this arrangement.
So it's a trap.
It's a trap, you heard shouted out there, and that was shouted out by New Forest MP Desmond Swain, naughty boy, and he's coming on at 6:40 to explain his behaviour. That was Geoffrey Cox. Earlier on, we heard Ollie Robbins explaining that the backstop is not exactly ideal. This before a committee this morning.
The backstop is not the future relationship that either the UK or the EU wants to have with one another. And so it is an uncomfortable position for both sides.
OK, joining me is LBC's political editor Theo Usherman. Theo, firstly, just a sort of comment on style. Geoffrey Cox, very posh, but really rather polished, I thought.
It was a swashbuckling performance from Geoffrey Cox. He has spent many years on the backbenches talking about his constituency down in Devon, talking about particular issues that he was interested in. He was then plucked in the last reshuffle to go and become the Attorney General and became almost instantaneously the crux of Theresa May's government, her cabinet, because his legal advice as the government's chief law officer is critical to whether this backstop is legal. Geoffrey Cox today saying that he thought it was. He admitted, he was upfront, he was frank with MPs. He didn't try to bluster them, he didn't try to bluff his way through or shout his way through. He simply said this was something, the backstop, that Britain was going to have to accept. It wasn't ideal, making the same argument as you heard from Ollie Robbins there, and the European Union didn't particularly like it. Now, just to remind your listeners, Nigel, exactly what the backstop is.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's funny, isn't it? I think the more people hear about this and the complexity, the less they know. So please.
So at the end of March, we leave the European Union, according to Theresa May. Now, Theresa May has always said that we're going to leave the single market and the customs union. The single market is relatively straightforward. The customs union is a bit more complicated because once you bring, say, iPads from China into the European Union, you can transfer those iPads between France and Germany and now currently the UK. The problem is when we leave and we were to set a lower tariff rate, say in an international treaty with China, you could import them into the UK and then you could transfer them over to France. And the incentive would be for the Chinese to bring them into the UK because we'd have, say, for example, this is all hypothetical, would have a lower tariff deal, which would mean that they would be much cheaper. And then you could bring them, and then that would, according to the European Union, affect the validity of the customs arrangement within the European Union. So what they've said is that once the transition period comes to an end at the end of December 2020, we should have a free trade agreement of sorts agreed between Britain and the European Union. But what happens if that hasn't been sorted out? The European Union have said that they don't like the idea of camera gantries along the border between Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. That isn't suitable. And at the moment, there doesn't exist a solution. So what
and of course, President Macron has said that any deal must allow the French to continue to have full legal access to. So we could finish up actually in this transition not negotiating.
Exactly. So we don't have a solution, and Theresa May has admitted that there isn't a solution at the moment. So what they've said is, well, if we haven't found one by the end of December 2020, we're going to have this backstop where Britain remains in a temporary customs arrangement. But then you have the question, well, how do we get out of that? We must be able to just pull the plug and say Britain's leaving that temporary customs arrangement.
But we can't.
But we can't. We can't do it unilaterally. We can only do it with the permission of the European Union. And the European Union, conversely, can only do it with the permission of the British. And so we end up in this interminable cycle, according to the Brexiteers, of being within the customs union. And that was precisely what Theresa May said in her Lancaster House speech wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
And of course, once we're in the customs union, we cannot go outside and sign trade deals that undercut the arrangements, that undercut the European Union.
Despite Mrs May, so yesterday Mrs May's at the G20, and she comes back and says, we're going to be signing trade deals with the rest of the world. And today her Attorney General confirms we could be trapped indefinitely.
So we can't sign the trade deal until we leave the customs union. And the other problem that annoys somebody like Donald Trump, for instance, is that even when we've left the customs union, we're going to remain within the common rule. We're going to have a common rule book, which means that we can't diverge from the European Union in terms of rules and regulations around animal welfare, for instance. And many people within the Tory party think that's a good idea, that you shouldn't be able to import chlorinated chicken. But Donald Trump and his advisors believe actually that one of the things they liked about Britain leaving the European Union was that was going to be possible. That actually we weren't going to be subject to those rules and regulations.
And there are probably some Australians think the same, and
exactly.
All around the world. Theo, just finally, we've got day after day of debate coming up, 5 full days of debate, and then a vote that's going to be happening at about 7 o'clock next Tuesday night. Rumours this morning, I think from the Sun newspaper, that vote could be delayed. Do you believe that?
Prime Minister spokesman spoke to Westminster journalists this morning and said the vote is going to go ahead.
OK.
They said he's going to go ahead. There's no prevarication. It's going to happen. And, of course, the government are prepared to lose it.
You best keep your camp bed in the office, I think. That was Theo Usherwood, LBC's political editor, who's in for one hell of a busy week. So let's just hear Geoffrey Cox, QC, once again.
There is, therefore, no unilateral right for either party to terminate this arrangement.
So it's a trap.
Well, there we are. Desmond Swain says it's a trap. I'm asking you, do you think we've been boxed into a corner? Do you think this is a trap? And if you think, no, actually, it'll all be OK, it'll all work itself out during the transition period, call 0345 6060 973. Or maybe you think Desmond Swain is right, that we're facing no taxation without representation, and Barnier and the gang have outfoxed us completely, in which case text to 84850. And given the frankness and the honesty, and I have to say this, honesty of Geoffrey Cox today, do you think Mrs May can survive this truth? The fact she's asking Parliament to sign us up to something for which there is no known way out. Tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC, and of course watch us on Facebook and comment there too. And I have to say, I thought that was quite refreshing. A lot of the commentators saying that Geoffrey Cox looked and sounded far more like a Prime Minister than anything we've seen at the dispatch box for a very long time. I'm going up to Manchester to speak to Bob. Bob, do you think MP Desmond Swain is right, that it's a trap?
No. I watched both things there. I watched the committee and Cox, and I must be honest, I thought all of them were very impressive, including the Brexit Secretary.
Yep.
I don't think it's a trap. What they explained was that neither side wants to stay in this backstop. They don't get fishing rights. They don't get money.
Well, they've got fishing rights now, Bob.
No, but within that period, they don't get it if we go into the Brexit backstop.
Right.
That's what he explained. And I'll be quite honest with you, Nigel. I mean, I've supported this all the way through. First of all, I don't believe that Brexit was just a Brexit vote. It was a rejection of Parliament and establishment. So what these guys are all getting involved for, I don't know. But I think there's a great danger of you and the people that we supported losing this. They are going to get the second referendum and it'll be gone. Let's get out of the door and then figure it out from there.
You could argue, Bob, that we're leaving one treaty, albeit the Treaty of Rome that then went on with several others, but we're leaving one treaty, and we're signing ourselves back into another treaty. However poor and imperfect I thought European Union membership was, you could argue that at least through Article 50 there was a way of leaving. We are now, or we're being asked, the House of Commons is being asked, to accept a treaty that we can't get out of. How is that acceptable, Bob?
But I don't think it is. They don't want it. We don't want it.
How do you know they don't want it?
Backstop, Nigel.
How do you know they don't want it, Bob? See, this is the narrative
they
now.
They've got no fishing rights. We don't pay money. Why would they want it?
But if we're trapped... But
Robbins
Bob...
also said that European countries could sue because they've not got the same benefits as British and Irish companies. But it was all very logical, Nigel.
Bob, if no agreement can be reached, right? If no agreement can be reached in terms of a future trade deal.
Yep.
And nobody wants the backstop triggered, least of all us, because it would separate Northern Ireland away from the rest of the United Kingdom, so that's impossible, and that's how clever Barney has been. The real problem, Bob, is that we could stay inside a transition for year after year after year. And it was also admitted today that the longer we stay in transition, the more money it will cost. I've been saying for weeks, forget 39 billion, it looks more like 60 billion to me. Bob,
but do you not get, Nigel, that we might be stuck in the European Union? We'll never get out of this unless we go now.
Well, Bob, I tell you what, you've put your finger on something very fundamental and very, very important. This is a dilemma that the Eurosceptics are facing in Parliament, and it's a dilemma, Bob, that I'm going to face in Strasbourg, because if this all goes through, the final vote, the final veto, will be with the European Parliament. So at some point in time, Bob, I'm going to have to ask myself, if this deal were to get through, do I vote for it? And do you know what, Bob? I think what the Prime Minister has done to us is so awful that I'm going to vote against it, even if that risks us being forced by our political class into a second referendum. What do you make of that?
I think the alternative is we never go.
Well, I tell you what.
It's a long game, Nigel, with the second referendum. You know that, yeah?
Well, Bob, to me, this deal is just unacceptable, and what I've heard today from Geoffrey Cox confirms we could be trapped indefinitely. Bob, I thank you very much indeed for your call, and I completely understand the argument. Bob is making the argument being made by Michael Gove and others, just take what's on the table, at least we leave the Treaty of Rome. It's just not good enough for me. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 6:15. Whatever the content was, the style of the Attorney General, Geoffrey Cox QC, today in the House of Commons was quite refreshing. Somebody who actually mastered their brief, spoke with confidence, dealt with questions, and I thought was pretty honest. Now, you could say he had to be, given that his legal advice had already been leaked to the Sunday Times, but he was frank, saying that we weren't in a great place with the backstop. It could be there indefinitely, but, it was worth the risk because this deal was the right deal. It gets us out of the European Union. And Bob from Manchester, our first caller, agreed with it. Others don't. It is a trap, and the paperwork should be produced. Well, appraisive it was. Why was Cox even there, if any lawyer would do? Well, he's the Attorney General, Chris, in Leeds. I think it was good that he was there. I seem to remember another Attorney General's legal advice taking us into an illegal war. Clearly reference to Iraq there, but I did feel the difference was that actually what Cox said today was pretty believable, although for me, I have to say, wholly unpalatable. And I think what Cox said today effectively directly contradicted what the Prime Minister was saying at the G20 yesterday. I really, honestly do. I'm off to Romford to speak to Tony. Good evening, Tony.
Good evening, sir. How are you?
Well, I'm all right, but when Desmond Swain shouts out, it's a trap, I think he's right.
Well, it does make a nice change for someone to actually answer a question, but I think the chap in Parliament only answered and said his piece because he was pushed into a corner.
Yeah.
I think he'd have gladly kept his mouth shut and only whispered as quietly as possible.
So you mean
if he could have got away with it?
The fact that his advice had been leaked meant that he had to come clean?
Yes, it was the best thing that ever could have happened.
So Tony...
Or would he still been sitting there going, what do we do? What do we do? What are we doing with our taxpayers? What do we do with them? What do we do with them?
Are you a leaver, Tony?
I voted to leave, sir, staunchly. And
Right.
I'm truly disgusted in the way it's all been dealt with. It's all underhand. As I was saying to the chap I was on the phone to, your researcher,
Yep.
I believe you call him, forgive the analogy, but we have...
I call him all sorts of things, Tony.
We have, and we are being treated by Europe like the red-headed stepchild and beaten as such. Now the limelight's on us. Oh, I'll tell you what, we'll stop beating you, but we'll offer you a special deal until the limelight goes away, and then we'll keep beating you. So basically, we could be stabbed, shot, hung or suffocated, but either way, we've got you by the short and curlies. I voted to leave, sir. That means pick up our bags, kick two fingers up and walk away. We did not ask for a deal when we bailed them out.
No.
Tony, why are we doing it now?
Tony, do you think that the Eurosceptics like Jacob Rees-Mogg and that gang and the ERG should hold firm and vote against this deal, even if there is a degree of risk of it being put to a second referendum? Yes. OK?
Yes, and the second referendum should not happen.
I agree with that.
We voted to leave.
I agree with that. I agree with that, but there is a risk.
Deals with the rest of the world.
But there is a risk. Tony, thank you. You couldn't be clearer. Nigel, a second referendum may be the only option to avoid being trapped in perpetuity in this relationship. I'd vote to remain, but before you go ballistic... Now, I don't go ballistic, Gary and Horsham. I actually accept the fact people have different points of view, and I like to have proper debates with people with that view. Some can't, they just scream, but hey. So before you go ballistic, with the intention of playing a long game, to disrupt the EU from within until they beg us to leave... Oh, Gary, please, don't put us through. All the while we're paying them 10 to 15 billion quid a year, they're not going to chuck us out, Gary, are they? Come on, be realistic about it. I have a lot of respect for Geoffrey Cox, obviously very knowledgeable and an asset to Parliament. He accepts the backstop is a risk, but in his opinion, less of a risk than rejecting the deal. That's a good summation on Twitter. Paul is calling from Waltham Cross. Good evening, Paul.
Good evening, Nigel.
So when you hear an MP, breaking normal parliamentary protocol and shouting at the Attorney General, it was quite funny, I thought, but shouting it's a trap. Was Desmond Swain right?
Yes, he was right.
Okay.
The thing is, at least one MP has actually turned around and said that it is a trap because it's the EU deal. Each of the deals that May has come back with, the first from Merkel, when she went over to Germany, the second from Macron, when she went over to France and she got her instructions, and then the third one was through the back door through Ollie. Now, at the end of the day, the people will rise. It isn't a matter of anything else now. The whole of Europe is rising because of what the EU is doing.
Yep, it is. It is.
The mass migration, which is going to be signed off on the 11th of December with the UN, is all part of the pact that the New World Order has got. So this is where we are now. We are looking at war.
Well, I don't know about war, Paul, but certainly political war. Paul, I thank you very much indeed. Ian says, Geoffrey Cox for Prime Minister, what a star. Very good speaker. He certainly is, which is why he's been one of the best paid QCs in this country for many, many years. Mark says the backstop is infinite. The UK will be permanent rule takers with no voice at the table, thanks to the Brexiteers. No, Mark, not thanks to the Brexiteers, thanks to this Prime Minister. She's put us in this situation because she did not want to leave many of the institutions of the European Union. She's tried to take us out in name only and keep us trapped in the rest of it. And that's why we are in this current mess. Joe is calling from Surbiton. Hi, Joe.
Hello, Nigel. I've spoken to you once before. Thank you for your service. And
welcome back. Sir. Welcome back. So were you impressed by what you heard from Geoffrey Cox today?
Well, I admire his quick wit, if not maybe deviance from protocol. I want to actually answer the question you asked earlier on.
Is it a trap? Yeah.
Is it a trap? I think it's all going to plan.
Oh, do you?
This is the plan, and I'll just explain myself.
Do.
In that, a negotiation to leave has been run by a Remainer. I think it would be so easy to convince Mrs May that this is a good deal because she honestly believes that it is a good deal, that she's a Remainer. She thinks to stay within the European protocols, institutions, all the EU systems is what's best for Britain. So it's been so easy for the EU to convince her that it's a great deal when we all know it surely isn't. And she was clearly put in position of PM for that reason by the Conservative people who voted her in because they are probably Remainers as well, or they were, like me, suckered in to think that she was going to be a bloody difficult woman, which she
good line, wasn't it? Good line, it wasn't true.
Unfortunately not. But I think we're going to look further ahead, like throw the vision up a bit. It's quite sure the thing will get voted down. We need to start thinking like a chess player now, and like your previous caller, think strategically as if we are at political war. There will be an election soon, and this is where UKIP has got to get its ducks in a row and ready to hit hard, strike first. So, Nigel,
I will in a few minutes talk a little bit about UKIP. I talked a lot about UKIP on the Sunday show yesterday, and Ian Dale is going to do a big piece on UKIP at about 7:15 this evening, Joe. All right.
A bit about that I've kind of wanted that drove me to call tonight. It's always a pleasure to speak to you, of course, but we've got to start showing a bit of unity here now. Where you have suffered from some really horrible accusations in the past, some real bad treatments, and from some very ill-informed people, and that's being nice. To be honest, mate. I do feel like you're a mate. I think you're doing the same thing to Stephen Lennon right now.
Oh, is that his name, is it? Yeah, he's got lots of names. I tell you what, Joe, I did debate this yesterday for a full hour, and I will talk a little bit about it in a few minutes, but for now I want to keep some more calls coming on this subject. Joe, thank you for your passion and kind words. Terry is calling from Barnet. Terry, is this a trap?
Hi, Nigel. Well, it was certainly very impassioned. I agree with you. I mean, did he study theatrics? Or perhaps a youth like mine wasted watching endless Crown Court. But, the tub thumping of it all, a very reasoned argument for sure, for the maintenance of some kind of mad old Chinese wall between the nation and its appointed. We're getting the fake books as usual, so nothing's changed there. Two parties to argue with would be bad enough. But 27 clamouring translations all saying no, no, no. This benefits stew, this gruel will flow forever.
So you think we're on a loser with the whole thing, basically, Terry?
Look, I think Jacob Rees-Mogg has had a role in weakening our position because he hasn't stood up strong enough. I think he could bat a little bit more forthrightly, personally.
Terry, I tell you what, I'm going to love you and leave you there. I'm going to play a clip of Jacob Rees-Mogg in committee earlier on today, and you can make your mind up whether he was going in as hard as you would like him to. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's now 6:30, and the Attorney General gives a star performance in the House of Commons, but does admit that we could be trapped indefinitely within the Irish backstop. I've had a lot of questions and texts and tweets today about UKIP. Unsurprisingly, we had an hour's phone-in yesterday on that subject. The NEC did meet yesterday, and whilst they said that they did not want Tommy Robinson to be a member of UKIP, they did not want him to be an advisor to the leader. And on the back of that, there's a motion of confidence being passed in the UKIP leader, Gerard Batten. The fact is, this march still goes ahead on Sunday, and this is a march at which Robinson and Batten are the key speakers. I'm told now it's not a UKIP march. I'm not really convinced by any of this. The photograph that was tweeted out on Friday by Gerard Batten showed sitting next to him was Tommy Robinson. Next to Tommy Robinson was a guy who had been convicted in 2016 of attempting to kidnap somebody armed whilst he was doing it. And that's the guy that's organising the march. And UKIP said, oh, no, he was just there as Tommy Robinson's bodyguard. Well, why did he have a pencil and paper? So I'm not convinced. I really am not convinced that this problem has been dealt with. And I think at a time when UKIP should be really riding high in the polls, they're obsessing about Islam and Tommy Robinson. I can't believe it. And on the back of that, former Deputy Chair of UKIP, Suzanne Evans, who will be quite known to some of you on LBC, other forms of media, and she's resigned today, saying enough is enough. It's a perverse direction the party's taking, and she'll be on with Ian Dale at 7:15 today. Now, Jacob Rees-Mogg was mentioned a few moments ago, and he had the chance this morning in committee to interview, question Steve Barclay, the new Brexit secretary, for whom this was his first big public outing. And let's have a listen. Do you think Jacob tried hard enough?
When previously has the UK allowed for taxation without representation? Because the EU will be setting our customs taxes, and we will have no say on it once we've left.
You're talking in terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol?
No, this is under the backstop. Annex 2, Article 3, subsection 2. Taxation without representation.
No, I don't accept that at all. I've got that precise text in front, so I'll pick that up and happily write to you on it. But we've covered why the backstop is undesirable, we've covered why we have no desire to go into it, and we've covered the safeguards that there are in order to allow us to exit from it.
But if the EU raises tariffs, we will have to follow, and we will have no vote on that at all. So it is taxation without representation, a fundamental constitutional principle given away in the backstop.
No, I don't accept that at all.
OK, but you don't seem to know about it, which is a bit of a problem.
Well, that was Jacob being rude in a very polite way. Not a particularly stunning performance, I would suggest, from the new Brexit secretary. Didn't seem to be terribly in control. And this point about taxation without representation is one that I've been making, particularly on American TV. I'll be making that point again later on this evening. You could equally argue, though, couldn't you? And Kevin says on Facebook, what have we gained from our 39 billion? Yet more taxation without representation, because we'll be chucking all this money in and having no say at all after March the 29th on Theresa May's plan. So not just customs tariffs, as Jacob mentioned, but this whopping sum of money, which will be nearer 60 billion, folk, before we're anywhere near the end of this. Mel says Frexit will get there before Brexit. Well, France certainly in a degree of extraordinary uproar. The most violent scenes in Paris that we've seen since 1968, and the big student rebellion that brought down President General de Gaulle in those days, and remarkable scenes. I mean, this is not the banlieue, but this is actually the Champs-Élysées, where you're seeing barricades being built in streets, shops being looted, pavements being torn up, real violence, and no particular sign of an end to it. So back to the question, are we now stuck in a trap? Desmond Swain thought we were. What does Tony, a new caller from Scunthorpe, think? Tony, hello? Hello, Tony? No, I can't hear you. I've lost you. That is a shame. So anyway, are we stuck in a trap? Someone thinks here it's a double trap. The EU will let us out of the backstop once they've negotiated good trade deals with the USA, China, etc. I don't know. I wouldn't run too far ahead with all of this. Raymond from Pentlow says, I've always believed no talking and a no-deal Brexit. Let the EU come to us. And Raymond, that is something that I've heard again and again from business people particularly, that you walk out of the room and wait for them to come after you. Now, I have got on the line, and let's just listen to that clip one more time. Attorney General speaking.
There is, therefore, no unilateral right for either party to terminate this arrangement.
So it's a trap.
Desmond Swain shouted out, it's a trap, and Desmond Swain MP joins me on the line now. Good evening, Desmond.
Good evening.
So you are the naughty boy of Parliament today.
Well, I think it was accurate. I think I was being helpful.
Right. Well, I tell you what, please tell us, why is it a trap?
Well, it comes down to the way you look at it. The Attorney General says that it's a risk. But it's a risk he's prepared to take. And that depends entirely on the point of view you take about the good faith and the interests that the European Union will have and the respect it has for our interests. And those of us who have a different view of the European Union and its motives and its self-interest will be disinclined to take that risk. But I think there's a much more fundamental point. You see, the Attorney General insists that this is very unlikely ever to happen. My view is that the very fact that it's there And it's in the agreement at the insistence of the EU. The very fact that it's there and we will be desperate to avoid it provides them with a huge negotiating leverage as we try and negotiate the trade deal that's to come, because nothing's agreed yet. It's been 20 months at least of negotiations. And the fact that they've got that lever, they've got that hold over us, is going to lead us to accept all sorts of unpleasant things in order to get a deal to avoid the backstop.
And is that what Monsieur Macron was doing when he talked about fisheries?
Exactly. Now, of course, fisheries aren't part of this deal at all.
No.
But nevertheless, aren't part of the withdrawal agreement at all. And the Attorney General says, and they're very upset about it. But of course, that doesn't stop them using their leverage, because each and every one of the 27 has a veto, which would in effect consign us to the backstop, from which he said there's potentially no way out. So every single one of them is going to have that negotiating leverage for something that they want. And if the French want is the fish, that's their leverage.
I know, and I thought that was a very, very grim warning, actually. I mean, the ink wasn't even dry on the document, and that had happened. Desmond, do you think that the European Union, Monsieur Barnier and his team in particular, have they acted in good faith in these negotiations, in your view, to date?
Well, it's difficult to tell. I mean, I just can't see how we could have managed these negotiations worse than it turns out we've done.
This is your party, Desmond. You're in power.
Well, yeah, but nevertheless, it's the reality is that if it, it's all very difficult to say, well, I would have started from here. But what we should have done at the outset have said, right, we are going to make all the preparations necessary to leave and trade with you on world trade terms. And that's the way it's going to be. Unless you've got a better offer, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't. No,
but from the start,
I agree with that, Desmond.
Desperate that we were desperate for a deal,
I
and you can hardly blame the European Union. Say it's bad faith for them to have negotiated for the best deal that they can get. So,
will you vote against this deal in all circumstances?
Don't you read my blog?
I'm asking you. I'm asking you a question.
Well,
if the Prime Minister says to you, because she loses first time, she then comes back for a second vote before Christmas, and she says to you, if you vote down this deal, there will be a second referendum. Do you still vote against this deal?
Well, does she determine whether there's a second referendum? Of course, I have to balance
she can threaten
that
it.
risk.
She can threaten
I have to balance it. I've got to haver. The fact is, the reason why I don't want to say I've decided how I'm going to vote now, of course, I'm deeply critical of the agreement, but there is that risk and there are other risks that I have to balance. But also, I do honestly believe that I owe it to my constituents to sit through the 5 days of parliamentary debate before reaching, or at least before announcing my decision. If I tell you now I'm voting against this, what on earth is the point of us having a parliament at all and having a debate?
OK, so you'll listen to the arguments. Well, you've certainly contributed so far. And has the Speaker told you off for shouting out?
No, he didn't. In fact, he called me, and then he was very complimentary afterwards and said everybody should follow my example and ask me such short questions.
Well, you've definitely...
But I suspect he didn't realise it was me.
You've definitely brought great colour to the day. Thank you, Desmond Swain, very much indeed. And that was Desmond Swain who shouted out, "It's a trap." You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 6:45. We've just heard Desmond Swain, MP, explaining why this is a trap, but he will listen to all 5 days of debate before making up his mind. But if it is a trap, how on earth can our government, when we're trying to get out of something, have negotiated a deal that could keep us trapped in indefinitely? Doesn't make much sense to me. This appalling backstop exists because we negotiated without a clear vision for the UK. Instead, it's been all about managing Tory MPs, which just leads to constant reaction and no long-term plan. Andy in Essex, brackets, Remainer. I think I'd rather agree with that, Andy. There was no clear plan. I thought there was with the Lancaster House speech. And then I heard the speech she gave in Florence when she basically said, we're going to leave the European Union, but try and opt back into almost all of it. And that's the problem, which she's trying to do both, and it just doesn't work. Right, second time of trying. I'm back to Tony in Scunthorpe, a new caller. Hi, Tony.
Hi, Nigel. Thank you very much for having me on and be so kindly coming back to me when
problem.
the line
no problem.
Earlier.
You're there. You're there.
Yeah.
You're on LBC. The floor is yours. Is this a trap, Tony?
Nigel, it's so obviously a trap that I believe the debate is really about how best can we avoid it. And my answer to that is as follows. I think we need to look at WTO in what I call a fair and reasonable view, as opposed to the pejorative phraseology, crash out. Now, I think a fair and reasonable view is as follows, that it is a temporary interregnum period whilst we negotiate our future and very valued relationship with the European Union. And we will do so with our hands free, as opposed to having our hands tied, and end up with a far better deal for everyone, Brexiteers and Remainers, to enjoy.
I think you've put that very well. Our hands will be free as opposed to being tied. I like that, Tony. That's very, very good. But there seems... do you think... given the hysteria against WTO, even though 90% of world trade takes place under those rules, do you think the British public would be prepared to accept that option, Tony?
Well, you raise a very interesting point there, Nigel, because my real bee in my bonnet, my incredible frustration, not being a politician, is that those people who believe in Brexit as I do, and by the way, I'm in an unusual category. I voted to remain out of loyalty to my son and daughter-in-law who are in financial services, but I'm a passionate Remain in my own heart because I value our sovereignty.
Right, so you were very conflicted then as you went into the polling station that day.
Well, not really, because I have no loyalty to my family, but I'm clear as to my arguments. But I believe what the problem we've got here is that, and my frustration is that the Remain side is way better than we are on the Brexit side at making their case, and where it comes to it, issuing pejorative statements. So, in answer to your specific question,
I agree with that.
We need to put the case. It's not something to be frightened of. It's something to welcome with open arms as a temporary interregnum period. And we'll end up with a far better deal with the EU, our most valuable market from the UK point of view, for both Brexiteers and Remainers to enjoy, and this is the important point, in the years and decades and generations to come.
Tony, you've made the point beautifully. Thank you very much indeed for that call. And Tony's right. The Remain camp are well-funded, well-organised. They have a full-on media strategy run, not just by Alistair Campbell, but he's certainly part of it, and he's rather good at that sort of thing. And the levers have tended to be a little bit scattered ever since the 24th of June 2016. I'm going down to Kent to Tenderton to speak to Pete, a new caller to the show. Good evening, Pete.
Hi there, how are you?
I'm all right. So, the Attorney-General, were you impressed?
I was conflicted throughout the whole thing. I think I'm a firm believer that we've been segregated into sides of Remain and Leave. I think that's firstly the biggest problem that we have as a United Kingdom. We need to remember that we should be united, but in doing so, we need to actually listen to what's being said to us.
Yep.
The biggest thing that concerns me the most of what I've listened to today is what's been said to Theresa May and why there's something that's so immeasurable that we as the public interest, we shouldn't hear about it.
Right. So Pete, just to, I know exactly what you're saying, just to sort of refresh everybody, what we got today was a document on the legal advice that had been given, but we didn't get the full text, did we?
Not at all. And I feel like it's the most important parts that have been left out because of clause public interest. And the public interest at the moment is surely the most important part, considering that the backstop's based on the EU's ability to not be undercut by the UK if we leave. There's a lot to be taken into consideration that I feel...
Well, Geoffrey Cox was honest about the bits that have been leaked to the Sunday Times already. I guess there wasn't much point in not doing so. But Pete, you're worried there's even more bad news out there, aren't you?
I am, purely because of the fact that the best lies told are the ones with truths involved in the lie. It's if you can honestly say to somebody, fine, my hands are up on this, that means I don't need to tell you about the rest because you've caught me out on this small fact. And that sometimes is the hardest thing to swallow 10 years down the line when it's too late to fix. And I genuinely feel that 20 months won't be 20 months.
No, it'll be 20. No, it'll be year after year after year, won't it?
Exactly. I mean, you wouldn't put anything under good faith unless you had the ability to be able to use good faith as a back-out clause.
It would certainly go. I mean, transition will almost certainly go until the next general election. But that's all assuming this deal gets accepted. Pete, you clearly were a Leave voter.
I was, yes. I was a Leave voter for many different reasons to what I am now. I had my own business and lost it through the recession, and felt that the amount of money that we spent during our time through the recession for the EU was far too much and far too detrimental to our country. Then I moved on to realising that actually the whole of the EU is stuck in the same position as us, and it's a broken system. It's not democracy. It's not what we want. And I think Remain or Leave, we should work together to try and create, as a united kingdom, the best way forward, not just a segregated view that the government are hoping that we'll argue ourselves through.
Oh, no. OK, Pete, listen, lots of passion there and deep suspicion. Thank you, Pete. So, Geoffrey Cox doing his best to come clean, but Pete making the point, what we got was what they wanted us to see, wasn't the whole deal. And when he was questioned on that, he said that it's actually in the national interest that, that your ministers can be briefed in private. Jim is calling from Dartford. Hi, Jim.
Good evening, Nigel.
So, it's a trap? It's a trap, is it?
It's a trap.
Right.
I've got 3 points to make.
Go on.
Firstly, listening to Desmond Swain talking about France, and you talking about France and the fish. Wasn't it strange how Spain were kicking off about Gibraltar? All of a sudden, they've gone quiet, which tells me something.
Well, that's because actually the Gibraltar problem was replaced with the Irish border problem. But anyway, go on, Jim. Second point.
Secondly, the CBI are backing this proposal. Now, for 2.5 years, business has been saying they need certainty. Mm-hmm. This deal will give them the exact opposite.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that, Jim, because we could just be stuck in the customs union forever. That gives them certainty, doesn't it?
Well, you wouldn't have thought so.
Well, I don't know.
I wouldn't have thought so.
Come on, third point, Jim.
The third point is we've been told that we didn't know what we were voting for.
Mm-hmm.
Yet the Attorney-General is not giving them all the advice they should have to vote next week.
He's giving a précis. He's given his version of it. Yeah, no, Jim, I understand that. I mean, Jim, thank you. I think Geoffrey Cox came clean on the bits he had to come clean with. Clearly, not everything's been released. That leaves one or two of you feeling a bit suspicious. And Luke in Bromley reminds us that it's 50 years ago this week that Elvis Presley launched Suspicious Minds, of course, with the phrase, "We're caught in a trap." And I think a lot of you do think we're caught in a trap. Desmond Swain certainly thinks we're caught in a trap.
And there's no turning back.
Well, I know, but there is, Ian, because Parliament can vote this down, albeit that does bring with
Nigel,
it
you know
huge
what they
risks.
say.